Peter Stone, the unassuming 45-year-old governor of Oregon, stepped into the cafe like any other customer. In jeans, a gray t-shirt, and a bright red Make America Great Again cap, he didn't look like someone wielding the power to shape state policies. That was exactly how he wanted it. A rare chance to experience life from an unfiltered perspective, without the barrier of his title. The cafe hummed with the early morning rush, filled with the clatter of cups and the murmur of conversations. Peter made his way to a corner booth, nodded politely at a barista, and opened his phone to catch up on the day's news. To him, the cap was just a nod to the diversity of opinions he regularly encountered. But to Lindsay Moore, it was a declaration of war. Behind the counter, Lindsay noticed the hat immediately. Her sharp eyes, framed by fiery red hair, zeroed in on Peter like a hawk spotting prey. A rainbow tattoo peeked from her wrist as she gripped a coffee pot, her knuckles whitening. Lindsay, known for her outspoken progressive ideals, was the self-appointed guardian of the cafe's values. To her, the cap wasn't fabric. It was a symbol of everything wrong with society, and she wasn't about to let it pass without confrontation. After a dramatic sigh and a glance at her co-workers, none of whom dared intervene, Lindsay stormed toward Peter's table. Her forced smile was so tight it looked like it might snap. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice saccharine, but pitched just high enough to ensure nearby customers could hear. "But I think you might have forgotten this isn't a rally." Peter glanced up, his calm blue eyes meeting her fiery gaze. He didn't react immediately, letting the silence hang just long enough to throw her off balance. "Good morning to you too," he said, his tone so neutral it bordered on disarming. But Lindsay wasn't here for pleasantries. "That hat," she said, her voice rising with each syllable, "is offensive. We're a progressive establishment, and I'm afraid you'll need to remove it or leave." The cafe grew quieter. Conversations faltered as patrons glanced over, pretending not to stare. Even the guy at the next table, mid-bite of his muffin, froze, crumbs hovering near his mouth. The tension was as thick as the foam on a poorly made latte. Peter set his phone down and gave Lindsay a measured look. "Offensive?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "I thought this was a cafe, not a debate stage." Her lips pressed into a tight line. "It's not up for discussion," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Either the hat goes, or you do." The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Peter, but he had no intention of escalating things. Instead, he stood with deliberate calm, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He placed it neatly on the table and slid his chair back with a quiet scrape. "I'll leave," he said, his tone even. "But not because you told me to." Lindsay blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his composure. She'd expected a fight, maybe a defensive tirade. Instead, she got this calm dismissal, and it gnawed at her. As Peter walked toward the door, Lindsay's sense of triumph surged. "Good riddance," she muttered, loud enough for a few customers to hear. A couple of patrons exchanged awkward glances, one even whispering, "Was that really necessary?" Peter paused briefly at the door, catching the reflection of the cafe in the glass. He noticed the stares, the whispered conversations. With a faint smirk that only he could see, he stepped out into the cool Portland air. Back inside, Lindsay turned to her co-workers, exuding the smug energy of someone who believed she'd just done the world a favor. "Someone had to stand up," she declared, as though she'd thwarted an existential threat. Her co-workers nodded weakly, though their eyes betrayed their discomfort. But the room didn't feel victorious. It felt off-kilter, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Unbeknownst to Lindsay, Peter Stone wasn't just another customer. He was the governor of Oregon, and the hat she hated so much wasn't an accident. He wore it to test the very limits of tolerance in his state, and Lindsay had just failed spectacularly. As the door swung shut behind him, Peter tapped out a quick message on his phone. "Interesting start to the morning," he wrote to his chief of staff. "Let's see how this plays out." Meanwhile, back in the cafe, Lindsay grabbed the 20 from Peter's table with a self-satisfied huff, tossing it into the register like she'd won a moral victory. She had no idea that by tomorrow, her decision to confront a stranger in a red cap would make her the center of a storm she couldn't have seen coming. The cafe hummed with subdued chatter after Peter left, but Lindsay stood at the counter like she'd just led a victorious protest. She basked in the stolen glances and murmured agreements from a few patrons. Someone had to stand up, she said to her co-workers, waving her hands for emphasis. Symbols like that don't belong here. Her colleague, a timid barista named Emma, offered a hesitant nod. I guess, but he didn't seem, aggressive or anything. Lindsay's fiery eyes darted toward Emma. It's not about him. It's about what that hat represents. If we let that slide, what's next? A rally in the middle of the cafe? Emma wisely returned to steaming milk, but the energy in the room was unmistakably awkward. A few customers shuffled in their seats, avoiding eye contact with Lindsay. Others quietly packed up their things, eager to escape the strange tension that now lingered. By noon, the cafe buzzed in an entirely different way. Lindsay's phone vibrated nonstop, and snippets of hushed conversations floated across the room. Did you see the video? Is that the guy from this morning? Wait, that was Governor Stone? At first, Lindsay didn't notice the shift. She was too busy congratulating herself on being a beacon of progressivism. But when her manager, a wiry man named Dave, stormed out of the back office with a look that could curdle milk, she felt her chest tighten. Lindsay, he barked. Office, now. The other baristas froze mid-task as Lindsay tried to keep her composure, walking briskly behind him. Inside the cramped office, Dave slammed his phone onto the desk in front of her. The screen showed a news article with an embedded video. The headline read, Governor Stone kicked out of Portland Cafe over MAGA hat. Lindsay blinked, the color draining from her face. Wait, that was him? Dave's nostrils flared. Yes, that was him. The governor of our state, Lindsay. The guy who controls things like zoning permits, grants, inspections. Should I go on? Lindsay's stomach twisted, but she quickly regained her defiance. He was wearing that hat. I didn't know who he was, but it doesn't change what I said. I was standing up for what's right. Dave pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a long, frustrated sigh. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some random customer upset about their latte. This is the governor. The backlash we're getting is insane. People are calling for boycotts, news trucks are outside, and social media is eating us alive. Lindsay crossed her arms. So what? I'm supposed to apologize for standing by our values? For refusing to cater to intolerance? Dave's exasperation was palpable. Our values. Lindsay, our value is selling coffee, not fighting culture wars. You better hope this doesn't get worse, or it's your job on the line. Meanwhile, across town, Peter Stone sat in his office, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, a far cry from the one he'd been forced to abandon earlier. His chief of staff, Rebecca, stood beside him, scrolling through a tablet filled with news alerts and notifications. It's everywhere, Rebecca said, shaking her head. The video's gone viral, and it's all anyone's talking about. People are either calling you a hero or painting you as a victim. Peter leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but thoughtful. Interesting. And the cafe? Rebecca smirked. Their Yelp page is a disaster. Half the reviews are from people applauding the waitress. The other half, well, let's just say they aren't coming back for the scones. Peter chuckled softly. All this over a hat, he said, more to himself than to Rebecca. It's not about the hat, though, is it? It's about the bigger picture. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? Peter set his mug down and folded his hands thoughtfully. I'm not thinking about revenge, if that's what you're worried about. But this isn't something I can let slide, either. It's an opportunity to remind people what tolerance and respect really mean. Rebecca tilted her head. So, what's the plan? Peter's lips curved into a faint smile. Let's arrange a visit. I think it's time for a little perspective. Back at the cafe, Lindsay's day had only gotten worse. The news crews had arrived, their cameras trained on the entrance as reporters jostled for space. "Can you confirm the governor was kicked out here this morning?" one shouted, shoving a microphone toward a startled barista. Inside, Lindsay tried to focus on her tasks, but her hands shook as she poured coffee. "Lindsay!" Dave called from the doorway, his voice a mix of urgency and exhaustion. "We've got a problem." "What now?" she snapped, her nerves frayed. Dave pointed toward the parking lot, where a sleek black car had just pulled up. The door opened, and out stepped Peter Stone, this time in a tailored suit that radiated authority. A swarm of reporters followed him as he made his way to the entrance, his every step calm and deliberate. "Oh my God," Lindsay whispered, her face turning ghostly pale. Dave shot her a pointed look. "You wanted a stand? Well, here's your chance to finish it." As Peter walked through the doors, the cafe fell silent. Customers stopped mid-sip, their eyes darting between Lindsay and the governor. Peter's gaze landed on her, his expression unreadable, but undeniably commanding. "Miss Moore, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I believe we need to talk." The morning sunlight barely broke through the thick swarm of reporters outside the cafe. Lindsay arrived at work, clutching her bag like it was a shield against the chaos. Microphones jutted out from every angle, cameramen jockeyed for position, and voices overlapped in a storm of questions. "Can you confirm the governor was kicked out? Ms. Moore, do you regret your actions yesterday? What does this mean for the cafe's future?" Lindsay tried to duck past them, her head down, but it was no use. A sharp-eyed reporter spotted her and pounced, microphone extended like a spear. "Ms. Moore, do you think it was appropriate to kick out Governor Stone over his hat?" "No comment," Lindsay muttered, her voice barely audible. She pushed past the throng and shoved the cafe door open with more force than necessary, the bell overhead jangling like it was tattling on her. Inside, the tension was no better. The staff whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward Lindsay like she was a walking scandal. Dave, her manager, stood by the counter, his face a cocktail of anger and exhaustion. "This is a disaster," he hissed as she approached. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I was standing up for what's right," Lindsay shot back, though her voice lacked the fire it had the day before. Dave groaned, rubbing his temples. "Right or wrong, you've turned this place into ground zero for a PR nightmare. If Peter Stone doesn't come in here and shut us down, the internet will." Before Lindsay could respond, the door swung open again, and the cafe fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Peter Stone walked in, but this wasn't the casually dressed man she'd confronted yesterday. Today, he wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like a glove. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being in charge. Cameras flashed outside the cafe windows, capturing every moment. The air seemed to thicken as he made his way to the counter. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and even the hiss of the espresso machine seemed to hush itself out of respect, or fear. Lindsay froze in place, her face draining of color. "Governor Stone," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter smiled politely, though his eyes held a sharpness that made Lindsay want to shrink. "Miss Moore, isn't it?" he said, his tone calm but commanding. "I believe we had a misunderstanding yesterday." I didn't know," Lindsay blurted, her words tumbling over each other. "I had no idea who you were." Peter tilted his head slightly. "And if I hadn't been the governor?" he asked, his voice steady but pointed. "Would your actions have been justified then?" Lindsay opened her mouth, but no words came out. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cafe boring into her, waiting for her response. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat refusing to budge. "I thought I was standing up for what's right," she finally managed, though the words sounded hollow even to her. Peter nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I respect your passion," he said. "But there's a line between standing up for your beliefs and trampling on someone else's, especially when that person happens to represent the state you live in." The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Lindsay wanted to disappear, to vanish into the background and pretend this wasn't happening. but there was no escape. The entire cafe was watching, their faces a mix of fascination, sympathy, and second-hand embarrassment. Peter turned to the rest of the room, his voice carrying easily. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "In fact, I believe in the kind of conversations that help us grow, even when they're uncomfortable. But respect needs to go both ways." The customers murmured their agreement, and even Dave gave a small, reluctant nod. Lindsay felt herself shrinking smaller and smaller. "And Miss Moore," Peter added, turning back to her, "I'd suggest thinking about the difference between making a statement and making a mistake. It's an important distinction." The silence was deafening. Finally, Peter gave a polite nod and turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, the cafe erupted in whispers and murmurs. Someone muttered, "Well, that was awkward," while another patron quietly applauded. Dave looked at Lindsay, his expression unreadable. "Clean up the tables," he said after a long pause. "And let's pray this doesn't get any worse." As Lindsay numbly grabbed a cloth and headed toward the nearest table, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the cafe window. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her impulsive actions. Outside, the reporters swarmed Peter, their questions firing like bullets. He paused briefly, smiled at the cameras, and simply said, "This isn't about the hat. It's about learning to listen before we judge." The comment made headlines by noon. As for Lindsay, she spent the rest of her shift dodging stares and trying to make herself invisible. But deep down, she knew. The world had already seen her, and there was no undoing it. By evening, the video of Peter calmly confronting Lindsay had taken over the internet. News outlets ran it on repeat, dissecting every word and glance like it was the Zapruder film of coffee shop conflicts. Opinions flew fast and fierce. Was Lindsay a hero standing up for her values, or a cautionary tale of unchecked arrogance? The cafe issued a swift apology, its tone as corporate as a stiff handshake. Lindsay, meanwhile, found herself on unpaid leave pending an internal review. The internet had no such patience. Memes flooded social media, with hashtags like #Hatgate and #ToleranceGoesBoth ways trending worldwide. One particularly viral post featured Lindsay's panicked expression under the caption, "When you realize you kicked out the governor over a hat." Protests erupted outside the cafe the next day. Some held signs reading, "Support Lindsay," while others chanted, "Fire the barista." The chaos turned the usually quiet corner spot into a three-ring circus. Peter, however, stayed above the fray. At a press conference, he addressed the incident with his signature composure. "While I don't agree with how I was treated," he began, "this isn't about one person or one hat. It's about how we approach disagreement in our society. We need to lead with respect, not division." The statement struck a chord, earning Peter widespread praise. Commentators hailed him as a model of grace under fire, while Lindsay became a lightning rod for the culture wars. Her inbox overflowed with everything from hate mail to marriage proposals. Eventually, Lindsay reached out to Peter directly. They met in a quiet office, far from the glare of cameras. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong to treat you that way." Peter nodded, his expression kind but firm. "Apology accepted. But next time, don't assume someone's values based on their hat. You might miss the bigger picture." Lindsay nodded, humbled. For her, the incident became a life lesson in humility. For Peter, it was a reminder of the power of dignity, even in the face of absurdity.